Today, we are going to look at the 6 Karens that died in very dumb ways. From a Karen who ignored a warning sign to win an argument, to a Karen who refused to wait and challenged a locked door, these are moments where entitlement met consequences in a very dumb way. It was September 18th, 2018. A major sports venue in Missouri, United States was at capacity. Concrete concourses vibrated as halftime released tens of thousands at once. Movement stalled immediately. Lines formed everywhere, concessions, exits, and most visibly outside the women's restrooms along the lower concourse. Security struggled to keep order. Lauren McBee was 36 years old. She worked in event coordination for a regional marketing firm, a job built around controlling schedules, movement, and logistics under pressure. Friends described her as efficient, but easily irritated by delays. Waiting frustrated her. Disorder bothered her. She believed most crowd problems came from people not knowing how to move. That night, those traits followed her into the stadium. As halftime peaked, Lauren joined a restroom line that stretched beyond posted capacity. Several stalls inside had been closed due to ongoing plumbing issues, noted on a printed sign taped to the door. Maintenance crews were working inside. Attendants directed foot traffic and asked patrons to wait. Lauren refused. Witnesses later described her pacing near the entrance, loudly criticizing the line and the women ahead of her. She accused others of cutting, demanded the door be opened, and complained that people didn't understand how lines worked. Phones came out. A few spectators began recording. The restroom door she focused on was locked from the inside. Maintenance had secured it while addressing an overflow, and the latch had already been under repeated stress from earlier attempts to force it open. Lauren kicked the door once, then again. Each impact echoed down the tiled corridor. An attendant told her to stop. She ignored the warning. On the next kick, the compromised latch gave way. The door swung inward suddenly. Lauren was already leaning forward mid-strike and had no time to regain her balance. She stumbled through the doorway and fell headfirst into the restroom. Her right temple struck the edge of a porcelain sink. The impact fractured her skull. She collapsed face down on the tile and did not move. Blood pooled beneath her head within seconds. Bystanders hesitated, some continuing to film. Nearly a minute passed before anyone checked her responsiveness and called for help. Paramedics arrived quickly. Lauren was unconscious with severe head trauma and no purposeful movement. She was transported to a nearby hospital, where scans showed extensive bleeding inside her brain. Doctors identified a massive intracranial hemorrhage. The force of the impact ruptured multiple blood vessels, causing rapid swelling that compressed critical brain areas. Despite emergency treatment, the damage was irreversible. Lauren never regained consciousness and was pronounced dead later that night. Stadium surveillance footage confirmed the sequence, including repeated kicks to the door and the latch failure under strain. The death was ruled accidental. In the weeks that followed, the stadium replaced restroom latches and revised halftime crowd control and maintenance protocols. After Lauren McBee died, the doors were reinforced and the rules rewritten. But the next confrontation didn't happen in a confined corridor. It happened in a place that never stops shifting, where water, weight, and momentum don't pause for arguments. It was August 3rd, 2016. By mid-afternoon, heat pressed down on a public marina in Clearwater. Rental traffic cycled steadily as jet skis returned to their slips, engines idling while wakes slapped against the docks. The water never settled. Boats moved constantly, churning the surface as dark clouds gathered offshore ahead of evening storms. Dana Whitaker, 47, stood near the rental dock with her phone raised, recording. She worked as a regional sales manager for a pool supply distributor, a role that rewarded persistence and confrontation. Co-workers later described her as aggressive in disputes and unwilling to concede fault, particularly when money or liability was involved. She frequently documented conflicts online, posting videos of arguments with service workers framed as proof that she stood her ground. Earlier that afternoon, Dinah rented a personal watercraft for a 2-hour slot. When she returned it near the end of her time, she pointed out a faint scuff along the lower hull and accused a 17-year-old dock attendant of causing the damage. The mark was minor and already noted in the rental log from a prior inspection. The attendant offered to call a supervisor. Dana refused, raising her voice, threatening legal action, and continuing to record. As the dispute escalated, she stepped closer to the dock edge, moving past a temporary floating platform marked "No Load," which witnesses said she ignored. Her right foot slipped off the edge, and she lost her balance. Dana fell sideways into the narrow gap between the floating section and a fixed wooden piling. Her torso dropped first, wedging her chest tightly into the space while her legs remained above the waterline. Moments later, a passing boat sent a heavy wake toward the dock. The surge drove the floating platform inward, slamming it against the piling and pinning Dana's chest. The pressure fractured several ribs and compressed her rib cage so tightly that her lungs could not expand. She screamed once, then struggled silently as her breathing became shallow and ineffective. Dock workers ran to the edge and tried to lever the floating section back using boat hooks and their own weight. The water pressure held it in place. Each small surge from passing boats tightened the compression again. Dana's movements weakened. Within minutes, she lost consciousness as oxygen deprivation progressed. When the water finally settled enough for the dock to shift outward, workers pulled her free. She was unresponsive and not breathing. Emergency services arrived shortly afterward, but resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. Dana was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner's report documented multiple fractured ribs, severe thoracic compression, and bilateral lung collapse. The sustained pressure prevented effective breathing long enough to cause irreversible hypoxic injury, followed by cardiac arrest. Marina surveillance footage confirmed Dana stepping past the warning sign before the fall. Her phone, recovered from the dock, contained the recording of the argument up to the moment she slipped. Her family initially threatened legal action, but after investigators reviewed the footage and inspection records, the lawsuit was withdrawn 3 months later. Dana Whitaker's argument ended the moment the environment stopped yielding. The next case didn't involve machinery or moving platforms, just a quiet park path where escalating a dispute meant stepping into something far more powerful than words. It was October 9th, 2017. Early evening light faded across a public park in the southern United States. Joggers completed their last laps as dog walkers drifted toward the exits before dark. The air was still, the ground dry, and visibility clear, conditions that usually kept encounters brief and uneventful along the paved path. Renee Alvarez, 46, arrived alone. She owned a small bookkeeping service and was known among acquaintances for confronting strangers over perceived rule violations. Friends described her as persistent to the point of fixation, especially when she believed public spaces were being misused. Once engaged, she rarely disengaged, even when asked. Near a bend in the path, Renee stopped beside a man walking 3 large Mastiff-type dogs. All were leashed on reinforced leads connected to a shared waist belt system, moving in tight formation at his side. Witnesses later noted the dogs appeared trained to work together and remained alert but controlled. Renee accused the man of allowing the dogs to foul the path. He responded calmly, stating none had relieved themselves and that waste bags were clipped to his belt. Several bystanders later said the exchange should have ended there. Instead, Renee continued, raising her voice and pointing toward the dogs as the handler asked her to step back and lower her tone. Renee moved closer, closing the distance between herself and the handler. As she entered the dog's working space, the animals reacted immediately, barking, bracing, and pulling against their leads in a clear defensive warning response. The handler attempted to step backward to create space and issued verbal commands, but Renee advanced again, now within arm's reach, continuing to shout and gesture sharply near the leash line. At that moment, all 3 dogs lunged simultaneously. Their shared training and proximity caused the movement to occur as a single action rather than separate reactions. The combined force pulled the handler off balance. His footing failed, and the leash system slipped as he fell sideways onto the path. Renee was knocked down almost immediately. The dogs attacked her arms, neck, and upper torso in a rapid, sustained defensive response lasting seconds rather than minutes. Witnesses described violent movement and repeated biting consistent with a perceived threat to their handler. The handler attempted to regain control, striking and pulling at the dogs, but was unable to stop the attack immediately due to their combined strength and momentum. Bystanders screamed and scattered. Several people attempted to intervene but retreated when the dogs turned outward defensively, snapping and posturing when approached. Park security officers already stationed elsewhere in the park responded within moments after radio calls from witnesses. Using auditory deterrents and physical barriers, they separated the animals approximately 40 seconds after the initial lunge. Renee was unresponsive when the dogs were pulled away. Blood pooled rapidly beneath her from wounds to the neck, forearms, and upper chest. Emergency responders arrived shortly afterward. She was transported to a nearby hospital, but resuscitation efforts failed. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death exsanguination from severe soft tissue and vascular injuries with rapid blood loss leading to hemorrhagic shock and cardiac arrest. Investigators reviewed witness accounts and surveillance footage showing Renee repeatedly advancing despite visible warning behavior and requests to step back. The death was ruled accidental, caused by provoked defensive animal behavior with no evidence of handler negligence. The dogs were quarantined during the investigation, no charges were filed, and the park later installed additional signage advising visitors to keep distance from leashed animals. Renee Alvarez kept advancing even after every warning was visible. In the next incident, there were no animals to react, only steel steps, a crowd in motion, and a decision made against the direction everything else was moving. It was February 14, 2015, in a crowded subway station in New York City. Evening rush hour was underway, and the platforms were packed with couples and travelers moving on habit rather than awareness. Trains arrived and departed on schedule. Escalators ran continuously, funneling dense foot traffic between levels in a steady mechanical flow. The station was loud, humid, and compressed, with little room for hesitation or error. Jane Tuffin was 38 years old and worked as a project coordinator for a regional marketing firm. Her role required constant schedule management and rapid problem-solving under deadline pressure. Co-workers later described her as efficient but easily frustrated, particularly when plans were disrupted. Transit police records showed she had been cited once several years earlier for disorderly behavior during a service delay after refusing to clear an escalator landing during a backup. That evening, Jane exited the wrong train car and missed her intended transfer by seconds. As the doors closed, she pivoted sharply and moved against the flow of passengers toward the nearest escalator, already carrying people downward. Witnesses later described her behavior as urgent and aggressive, forcing her way through the crowd and ignoring shouted warnings from nearby commuters as she rushed toward the moving stairs. The escalator was clearly operating in the downward direction, with indicator lights active and a full stream of riders descending. Rather than waiting or moving to the opposite bank, Jane stepped directly onto the escalator, brushing past descending riders and attempting to force her way upward against the flow. The moving steps immediately disrupted her balance. Her posture leaned forward as she tried to climb, placing her weight unevenly while the escalator continued pulling downward beneath her. As she reached the lower landing, where the moving steps flattened into the fixed metal comb plate, her foot failed to clear the transition. The sole of her shoe caught in the narrow interface between the moving step and the stationary plate. The escalator did not stop immediately, as the comb plate safety switch failed to trip for several critical seconds. The trapped foot was pulled backward as the descending steps and pressure from riders behind continued driving her body forward. The sudden arrest of her lower body caused her knee to twist violently, dislocating under the force. Her torso pitched forward and downward as the escalator continued moving. With no ability to recover her footing, her body folded at the waist. The force drove her head and shoulders sharply downward while her foot remained pinned, transmitting violent flexion and axial compression through her neck. Multiple witnesses reported hearing a sharp cracking sound as her body went limp. The escalator continued moving for several seconds, with the weight and movement of the descending crowd contributing to the sustained force that drew her folded body partially beneath the steps. Nearby couples and travelers recoiled and scrambled away as emergency stop buttons were pressed. By the time the mechanism halted, Jane was motionless and unresponsive. Station staff reached her within moments and initiated emergency procedures. She showed no signs of consciousness or voluntary movement. Emergency medical responders arrived shortly after and pronounced her dead at the scene. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death to be a catastrophic cervical spine fracture at the base of the skull. The injury resulted from violent neck flexion and compression caused by the sudden entrapment and forward momentum of her body. The fracture severed the spinal cord immediately, stopping respiratory function and causing instant loss of consciousness. There was no opportunity for intervention or recovery. Several commuters had recorded the incident from different angles, capturing the attempt to run against the escalator's direction and the sudden collapse at the base. Transit authorities reviewed and archived the footage. It was later incorporated into internal safety training materials, illustrating the dangers of escalator misuse during peak traffic conditions. The footage became a lesson in what happens when impatience meets a machine that doesn't stop. The next death unfolded outdoors, where the danger wasn't mechanical failure, but speed, blind curves, and a refusal to wait behind a barricade. We've got more everyday confrontations that ended in fatal mistakes, so subscribe if you want to see how small arguments can become deadly in seconds. It was July 17, 2016. Mid-morning heat settled over a temporarily closed roadway in a provincial city in Mindanao, where traffic cones and metal barricades marked a rolling roadblock for a sanctioned regional cycling event. Volunteers and road marshals stood at key intersections, redirecting pedestrians and vehicles as racers approached in staggered waves. Patricia Manalo, 54, lived nearby and was walking toward a grocery store when she encountered the closure. She worked part-time as an office administrator and was known among neighbors for frequent disputes with city staff over parking enforcement and temporary restrictions. Friends described her as persistent and confrontational when she felt inconvenienced, especially by rules she hadn't personally agreed to. At the barricade, a road marshal explained that cyclists would be passing through for several more minutes and asked Patricia to wait behind the barrier or use a marked detour. She refused. Witnesses said she accused the marshal of overstepping authority and began filming him on her phone, insisting the road was public and she had a right to cross. The marshal repeated the instruction and stepped to the side to block the lane. Patricia moved with him, continuing to argue. As she spoke, she edged past the barricade and into the cycling lane, gesturing sharply and raising her voice. The marshal told her to step back immediately. She did not. The course curved downhill just beyond the intersection, limiting sight lines. A competitive cyclist approached at speed, leaning into the curve and focused on the racing line. By the time he saw Patricia standing in the lane, there was no distance left to brake or maneuver. The collision was direct. The cyclist struck Patricia at high speed, lifting her off her feet. Her body rotated backward and slammed headfirst onto the asphalt several feet away. Witnesses reported a loud impact, followed by immediate stillness. The cyclist was thrown clear, slid into a roadside barrier, and suffered a fractured collarbone and extensive road rash, but his injuries were not life-threatening. However, Patricia did not move, and blood spread beneath her head within seconds. Emergency responders arrived quickly and found her unconscious with severe head trauma. She was transported to a nearby hospital, where imaging revealed extensive skull fractures and widespread bleeding within the brain. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death was a catastrophic blunt force head injury. In plain terms, the impact fractured her skull and caused massive brain hemorrhaging. Loss of consciousness would have occurred immediately, with fatal brain swelling following shortly after. Race officials reviewed footage from nearby traffic cameras and spectator phones, which showed Patricia stepping into the course mid-argument despite repeated warnings. The death was ruled accidental. The race resumed after a delay. Additional barriers were added to subsequent course points, and marshals were instructed to maintain greater distance from pedestrians during future events. Patricia's phone was recovered from the roadway, still recording at the moment of impact. The road was reopened, the barriers reset, and the race moved on. The final case took place far from crowds and vehicles, where there were no marshals to intervene, only loose ground, open space, and one step taken while still arguing. It was September 12, 2017, near Springdale, Utah. Late morning light filtered into a narrow canyon where a maintained hiking trail clung to exposed rock. Sandstone walls closed in as the path narrowed to less than 3 feet. The air was still and dry, conditions that rangers often described as perfect and dangerously misleading. Marilyn Hodge, 61, had driven in alone that morning from a nearby vacation rental. Recently retired from a clerical position at a regional insurance office, She was known among former co-workers for strict adherence to rules as she understood them, and for confronting others when she felt standards weren't being followed. She walked daily in her neighborhood and described herself as an experienced hiker, though her experience was limited to paved trails and short scenic loops. The canyon trail she chose that day was rated moderate, with posted warnings about drop-offs and unstable footing near the outer edge. Yield signage appeared at trailheads and along tight sections, advising uphill hikers to give way and to step toward the inside wall when passing. Marilyn had read similar signs before and often disagreed with how they were applied in practice. About 40 minutes into the hike, Marilyn encountered a group of 4 hikers approaching from the opposite direction, 2 middle-aged couples carrying day packs and trekking poles. The trail at that point narrowed along a bend, with a steep rocky slope dropping away on the outer edge. Passing required one party to step aside and wait. Marilyn stopped in the center of the trail and confronted the approaching group, accusing them of crowding the path and ignoring trail etiquette. When one hiker suggested she step toward the canyon wall to pass safely, she refused and continued lecturing, pointing down the trail. As she spoke, she stepped backward without looking. The outer edge was compacted dirt over loose gravel, already disturbed by foot traffic. On her third step, the gravel gave way. She lost balance, flailed briefly, and fell backward over the unguarded edge. The initial drop was nearly vertical. Her body struck a rock ledge approximately 20 feet below the trail, then continued to tumble down slope. Witnesses counted at least 3 separate impacts as she fell an estimated 200 feet through staggered rock shelves before coming to rest on a narrow outcrop. The group froze briefly before one hiker shouted for help. Another attempted to descend but stopped due to the steep drop and lack of handholds. From the trail, Marilyn was visible but unresponsive. One hiker called 911 while another activated a GPS beacon. Poor reception delayed contact as rangers and search and rescue were dispatched. By the time responders arrived at the trailhead, the afternoon heat had intensified and shadows filled the canyon floor. A helicopter assessment determined that immediate extraction was unsafe due to wind patterns and limited landing options. Ground rescue teams attempted a descent from above, but were unable to reach her position before nightfall without significant risk. Rescue operations were suspended overnight. The following morning, a technical rescue team reached Marilyn's body using ropes anchored from above. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner's report listed the cause of death as multiple blunt force injuries due to a fall from height. In plain terms, the repeated impacts caused catastrophic trauma. Marilyn suffered extensive skull fractures, a shattered pelvis, collapsed lungs, and internal bleeding. Several injuries were independently fatal. Loss of consciousness would have occurred within seconds of the initial impact. Investigators noted that death was likely instantaneous or occurred very shortly thereafter. Statements from the hikers were consistent, and trail conditions were documented with photographs. There was no evidence of a physical altercation. The fall was ruled accidental, precipitated by loss of footing near an exposed edge. In the weeks following the incident, park officials installed additional warning markers at narrow sections of the trail, emphasizing inside edge yielding and unstable footing. A ranger briefing later cited the case during seasonal safety orientations as an example of how quickly routine disputes can turn fatal in exposed environments. Thanks for watching. If you want to see how everyday arguments escalate into fatal decisions, the next case is waiting here.